The first fox died before it even understood what had hit it. A single kick, delivered with such catastrophic force that its ribcage collapsed inward, like a tin can, crushed under a boot, the sound echoing across the red dust clearing like a gunshot in a cathedral of silence. Its body cartwheeled through the superheated air, trailing a mist of blood that caught the early morning light and transformed into a crimson halo before the carcass slammed into the base of a ghost gum with a wet, final thud. 13 foxes remained, circling the creature that had just demonstrated the brutal mathematics of the Australian Outback. That size, when combined with strategic positioning and explosive muscle power, trumps numbers every single time. The boomer stood in the center of the killing ground, his massive chest heaving with controlled breaths, his dark eyes tracking each predator with the cold calculation of a general who has already won the battle in his mind and is now simply executing the script written in blood and bone. If you think you know how kangaroos fight, if you believe the sanitized nature documentaries have shown you the truth about Australia's most iconic marsupial, then what you're about to witness will shatter every assumption you've ever held about these creatures. And if you want to see the raw, unfiltered reality of survival in the world's harshest inhabited continent, subscribe right now and smash that like button, because this story goes deeper and darker than anything you've seen before, and missing what comes next means missing the most brutal tactical masterclass ever delivered by an animal defending its ancestral ground against an invasive plague that has devastated Australia's native species for 2 centuries. The boomer was no ordinary red kangaroo, and anyone who had spent time in the Flinders Ranges could have told you that this particular stretch of territory, 3 square kilometers of red earth, spinifex grass, and ancient waterholes, belonged to a legend that had been whispered about in the distant homesteads and among the Aboriginal communities who still maintained their connection to this land through stories passed down across generations that stretched back long before European settlement, had transformed the continent into a battlefield between native and invasive species. This patriarch stood nearly 2 meters tall when fully upright, his body a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering that weighed close to 95 kilograms and represented the absolute peak of what a male red kangaroo could achieve in terms of size, strength, and the kind of battle-hardened intelligence that only comes from surviving 7 full seasons in an environment where mercy is a luxury no creature can afford, and every single day presents choices that separate the living from the dead. With the finality of a judge's gavel striking wood, his chest bore the scars of countless territorial disputes, white lines where dingo claws had raked across fur and flesh during midnight ambushes near the waterhole, a torn ear from a wedge-tailed eagle that had made the fatal mistake of targeting what it thought was vulnerable prey and instead found itself dragged from the sky by forelimbs equipped with claws sharp enough to disembowel, and dozens of smaller marks that told stories of battles against other boomers, against introduced predators, against the very land itself during the brutal summers when temperatures soared past 50 degrees Celsius and survival became a minute-by-minute negotiation with dehydration and heat exhaustion that killed the weak with democratic efficiency. The morning sun was climbing higher above the jagged ridgeline of the ranges, transforming the eastern sky into a gradient of colors that ranged from deep purple at the horizon to pale blue overhead. And with that rising sun came the heat that would define every tactical decision made in the coming battle, the invisible enemy that punished all movement, all exertion, all expenditure of energy, with the merciless arithmetic of thermodynamics in a landscape where shade was sparse and water was the currency that purchased continued existence. The ancient waterhole behind the boomer reflected that sky in its surface, a perfect mirror that would soon be disturbed by violence, and the river-red gums that surrounded the clearing stood as living monuments to resilience, their massive trunks scarred by fire and flood, and the countless dramas of predation and survival that had played out beneath their branches across centuries of unchanging cycles. The foxes had arrived at this place driven by desperation, after 3 months of drought had transformed their usual hunting grounds into a wasteland where even the rabbits, themselves an invasive species, introduced by the same colonial hubris that had brought the foxes, had either died or migrated toward distant water sources, leaving the predators with a choice between starvation and territorial expansion into areas they would normally have avoided, because something in their genetic memory understood that certain boundaries existed for reasons written in blood and the bones of those who had crossed them before. European red foxes, vulpes vulpes, descendants of animals released by homesick English settlers in the 1850s, who wanted to recreate the fox hunts of their aristocratic homeland, had become one of Australia's most catastrophic ecological disasters, a plague species responsible for driving at least 20 native mammal species to extinction and pushing dozens more to the brink of disappearance, killing an estimated 300 million native animals every single year with the efficiency of a biological weapon unleashed on a continent whose fauna had evolved in splendid isolation for 50 million years and possessed no defenses against predators that hunted with European cunning and adaptability. These 14 foxes represented a hunting pack that had formed out of necessity rather than natural social structure. Foxes are typically solitary hunters, but desperation breeds cooperation, and the alpha male leading this group had learned that coordinated attacks could bring down prey that would be impossible for a single fox to kill, turning the pack into a flexible tactical unit that had successfully overwhelmed wallabies, wombats, and even the occasional young kangaroo separated from its mob. They had crossed into the boomers' territory 3 hours before dawn, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the confidence of creatures who had never encountered serious resistance, their rust-colored pelts blending perfectly with the red earth as they navigated through stands of mulga and patches of spinifex that stretched across the landscape like a vast, prickly ocean frozen in time. The lead fox, a battle-scarred male weighing perhaps 7 kilograms and measuring 60 centimeters from nose to tail tip, had survived 4 years in the harsh interior, an impressive lifespan for a species whose average life expectancy in the wild rarely exceeded 3 years. His torn ear and the white scar tissue across his muzzle testified to previous fights, probably with dingoes or other foxes competing for territory, and his eyes carried the cold pragmatism of a predator who had learned to read prey behavior, to identify weakness, to exploit the moment when fear transformed into paralysis and flight became impossible. He had led his pack to this waterhole based on scent trails and the simple logic of drought survival. Where there is water, there is prey, and where there is prey, there is the opportunity to kill and eat and continue the biological imperative that drives all living things toward tomorrow regardless of the cost paid today. But what the lead fox did not understand, what none of the 14 invaders could possibly comprehend, because their evolutionary history contained no reference point for such an encounter, was that the creature standing between them and the waterhole was not prey in any meaningful sense of the word, but rather a tactical genius wrapped in fur and muscle, who had spent 7 years learning every centimeter of this terrain, every hiding spot, every approach vector, every environmental advantage that could be leveraged in combat against multiple opponents. The boomer's massive tail swept slowly across the ground behind him, that incredible appendage that served as the foundation of his entire combat system, a muscular structure so powerful it could support his full body weight, while his hind legs transformed into weapons capable of delivering force that exceeded what most people associate with kangaroo behavior, because the sanitized nature documentaries prefer to show joeys in pouches and mobs grazing peacefully, rather than the brutal reality of what happens when a fully mature male defends territory against threats that trigger the ancient survival protocols encoded in marsupial DNA across millions of years of evolutionary pressure. His ears rotated independently, tracking the subtle sounds of the foxes as they began to fan out in what their predator instincts told them was a tactical formation, a crescent shape that would allow them to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming their target through coordinated strikes from the flanks while the center held attention, a strategy that had worked perfectly against slower prey species, but was about to collide with a defender who understood geometry and timing, and the fatal overconfidence of predators who had spent too many easy hunts killing animals that could only run and never learn to fight back with the devastating precision that was about to be unleashed across this blood-soaked clearing in the middle of the Australian interior. The clearing was not just open space. It was a carefully chosen arena carved by time and claimed by instinct. A pocket of bare red earth framed by river-red gums and low scrub that turned this patch of the outback into a natural funnel. The waterhole sat behind the boomer, a shallow, muddy bowl no more than 8 meters across, ringed by cracked clay that bore the prints of emus, roos, and feral camels that had passed through under cover of night. To reach it from the fox's side of the scrub, you had to squeeze between trunks and roots that narrowed the approach into channels barely wide enough for 2 animals to pass shoulder to shoulder. For prey, it was a trap. For a defender the size of this boomer, it was perfect geometry. With his back to the water and the low sun rising behind him, he forced any attacker to run toward blinding light, while he remained in broken shade, his silhouette hard to read through glare and shimmer. The foxes spread out, but the land refused to cooperate with their plan. Spinifex clumps and scattered rocks broke their arc into jagged angles, forcing them into staggered lines rather than a smooth circle. The alpha male tried to compensate, pacing at the center about 20 meters out. Tail low but rigid, jaws parted as he panted in the thickening heat. This formation, or something like it, had worked before on wallabies and young roos. Harass feint pushed them into panicked flight, then cut them down at the edges. But the boomer did not flinch, did not turn, did not offer the fleeing back that their instincts were begging to see. He stood on his tail line like a sentry post, hammered into the earth, forcing them to close the gap on his terms. Heat poured into the clearing like an invisible flood. Even this early, the air already shimmered above the red dirt, turning the line of ghost gums into wavering ghosts, their white trunks bending in mirages. Foxes were built for cooler nights, for damp gullies and shadowed fence lines, not for the furnace of the inland sun. Their tongues lolled out, sides heaving a little faster with each step, tiny paws pressing into soil that was starting to radiate stored heat back up into their bodies. By contrast, the boomer breathed slow and deep, every inhale deliberate. Blood pushed toward his forearms and ears, where the thin skin could dump heat into the dry air. He licked his forearms in quick, economical strokes, leaving a sheen of saliva that would evaporate and cool him without wasting more moisture than necessary. His eyes never stopped working. He tracked not just bodies but micro-movements, a twitch of a tail, a glance between 2 younger foxes, the slight stutter in pace that betrayed hesitation. On his left flank, 3 males tried to widen out, threading through scattered spinifex in a clumsy attempt at a wraparound, hoping to find a blind spot behind his shoulder. On the right, 4 more edged forward with less conviction, their steps shorter, ears flicking back toward the alpha, as if seeking reassurance that this was still a good idea. The boomer filed each of these details away, not as thoughts in human language, but as pulses of certainty. These 3 will commit first, those 4 will hang back. The leader will come late, aiming for distraction and throat. His tail pressed harder into the earth, testing the ground's grip, feeling how much it would give when he launched. Then the sound came, a single sharp bark from the alpha, neither question nor warning, but an order carved from desperation. The loose arc tightened, foxes shortening the distance in an uneven wave, some trotting, some breaking into a low sprint, their bodies dragging trails of dust as they moved. From above, a wedge-tailed eagle traced a slow circle, its shadow sliding over the scene like an omen, as if even the sky knew blood was about to be spilled. The boomer still did not move, and that stillness was its own kind of violence, a coiled promise that the first step inside his invisible ring would trigger something catastrophic. 10 meters now. The fox's breathing grew ragged, a chorus of panting lost under the soft crunch of claws on baked ground. In the red dust between them, the battlefield had already chosen its victor. The bodies had simply not caught up to the decision yet. The first 3 foxes broke formation together, a ragged wedge rushing from the left in what should have been coordinated aggression, but fell apart the instant they entered striking range. The boomer pivoted on his tail with blurring speed, his entire body rotating like a weapon system, locking onto targets, and his right hind leg whipped out in a devastating arc that connected with the lead fox's ribcage with a sickening crack. The impact launched the animal backward. Chest collapsed inward, lungs punctured by shattered bone, dead before it even hit the ground 3 meters away in a cloud of red dust. The second fox tried to abort mid-charge, claws scrabbling for traction, but momentum betrayed it, and the boomer's left leg came down like a falling axe, raking across its spine with claws that severed the cord clean through. It dropped instantly, hind legs useless, dragging itself forward with front paws in a horrible crawl that lasted only seconds before shock shut everything down. 2 dead in 3 seconds, and the lesson was written clear. Distance was survival, and they had just surrendered it. The third fox got inside the leg range, jaws clamping onto the boomer's lower thigh, teeth finding purchase in thick muscle and fur. For a heartbeat, it seemed the pack tactics might work. Stay close, stay low, use teeth where kicks can't reach. Then the boomer dropped forward onto his forearms, and those deceptively gentle-looking limbs revealed their hidden purpose. Claws, curved and sharp as surgical blades, sank deep into the fox's shoulders and dragged it upward in a brutal embrace. What followed was mechanical, almost clinical. Both hind legs came up simultaneously in a disemboweling strike that split the fox's belly open from sternum to pelvis, intestines spilling out in a steaming coil, while the animal's brain took agonizing seconds to understand it was already dead. The boomer released it, and the body hit the earth in a wet heap, organs still pulsing with fading electrical signals, and the metallic stench of opened viscera flooded the clearing like a chemical warning to everything still breathing. The alpha barked again, sharper now, edged with something that sounded almost like fear, but the momentum of desperation pushed the pack forward, because retreat would mean admitting this had been suicide from the start. 4 foxes hit from the right side in better coordination, forcing the boomer to choose which threats to meet first, and he chose aggression over defense, launching forward in a short explosive hop that closed distance before they expected it. His tail swept sideways like a club, catching one fox across the skull with a crack that sent teeth flying and left the animal staggering in tight circles, jaw hanging at an unnatural angle. Another latched onto his forearm, teeth sinking deep, and the pain should have mattered, but adrenaline had turned his body into something beyond pain, something that simply registered damage as tactical information and responded by slamming that arm downward with the fox still attached, crushing it against the hard-packed earth until ribs snapped and organs ruptured beneath fur. The heat pressed down now like a physical weight, sun climbing higher and turning the clearing into an oven that cooked everything beneath it without mercy or distinction. The foxes were slowing visibly, their European physiology never designed for sustained combat in 50-degree heat, tongues lolling, sides heaving with desperate pants that wasted moisture into air so dry it felt like breathing sand. Blood pooled and darkened the red earth, turning dust to mud that steamed in the climbing temperature, and the smell was overwhelming. Copper and ammonia, and the acrid stench of bowels released in death. Overhead, the wedge-tailed eagles circled lower, joined by others who had seen this pattern before and knew what it meant, their shadows crossing the carnage below like dark blessings from scavengers who would inherit whatever the boomer left behind. The ghost gums stood pale and silent, their bark reflecting sun with such intensity it hurt to look directly at them, ancient witnesses to violence that was neither cruel nor kind, but simply inevitable. 7 foxes down in under 2 minutes, and what remained of the pack scattered as individual survival finally overpowered whatever desperate cohesion had brought them here. But the boomer moved forward rather than holding position, closing distance with deliberate hops that said clearly there would be no retreat, no mercy, no survivors to carry warning back to whatever territory they had abandoned. His chest was slick with blood, some his from the bite wounds, mostly theirs from open throats and ruptured organs, and his eyes tracked each remaining fox with the cold focus of something that would not stop until the invasion was answered completely. The alpha male understood now, understood with the sick certainty of a commander watching his strategy collapse into rout, but understanding changed nothing, because the boomer was already choosing his next target, and the red dust between them had become a covenant written in bone and blood that would be read by every predator downwind for weeks to come. The alpha male made his fatal error not from strategy, but from desperation, the kind that overrides survival instinct and replaces it with blind aggression born from watching half your pack die in minutes. He charged alone, abandoning the other 6 foxes scattered at the edges, gambling everything on speed and the slim hope that his jaws might find the boomer's throat before those devastating hind legs found him. It was the move of a predator who had run out of options, whose brain still believed aggression could overcome the simple physics of mass and power that had already written the outcome in blood across red earth. The boomer read the charge before it began, saw it in the coiling haunches and weight shift, and instead of bracing, he hopped forward to meet it, eliminating the running start and turning collision into close-quarters grapple, where size would decide everything. They met in a tangle of fur and snapping teeth, the alpha seeking throat, while the boomer's forearms worked for a killing grip, and for 3 heartbeats it almost looked even. Then the boomer's tail slammed down like an anchor driven through stone, his body stabilizing with such force that dust exploded outward, and both hind legs came up together in a double kick that caught the alpha mid-lunge with the sound of something breaking deep and final. The fox's spine shattered at the lower vertebrae, back legs going instantly limp, even as his front half kept fighting for 2 seconds before his brain registered that everything below the rib cage had stopped answering commands. He collapsed hard, mouth still working, trying to bite at dust itself as if rage alone could reconnect severed nerves, and the boomer stepped back and watched without expression as the light behind those eyes dimmed from fury to nothing. If you're still watching, and you can feel your pulse hammering with the brutal reality of what survival costs, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me whether the foxes ever had a real chance, because what comes next shows that nature doesn't deal in fair fights, only lessons written in blood. The 6 remaining foxes broke in every direction, coordination evaporating like water on superheated iron, and they ran with the single-minded panic of prey who had finally understood their place in this equation. 3 bolted west toward scrubline, where Mulga promised cover, but the boomer was already moving, his massive bounds eating distance with mechanical efficiency that closed gaps faster than exhausted foxes could widen them. He caught the slowest within 15 meters, a younger male whose inexperience had kept him at the back of every charge, and one kick to the skull base dropped it with neck broken so cleanly there wasn't even a final twitch. The second fox made the tree line, but fatigue had stolen its agility, and when it tried to dodge between ghost gums, the boomer followed through and brought both forepaws down on its spine like hammer on anvil, compressing vertebrae and rupturing organs. The third went low through thicker scrub where size became disadvantage, and for 30 seconds escape looked possible. But the boomer stopped chasing and planted himself on his tail, ears rotating to track desperate scrambling through undergrowth, waiting for the fox to commit to direction, before taking 3 angled bounds that intercepted it where vegetation thinned. The collision was brief. One raking strike that opened the fox from shoulder to hip and left it thrashing in red dirt, bleeding out in under a minute, while the boomer turned east toward the final 3. They had chosen open ground, running toward a distant ridgeline that shimmered in heat, like a mirage they would never reach, already dying from exhaustion and thermal stress before he closed distance. One collapsed mid-run, legs folding, tongue swollen black, panting so fast it looked like seizure, and the boomer delivered mercy with casual efficiency before pursuing the last 2 who had turned at bay against stone outcrop. They bared teeth in final defiance, but their bodies were cooked from inside by heat that had turned blood thick and muscles useless, and flight was no longer possible. The boomer approached without hurry, and what followed was quick and professional. 2 kicks, 2 bodies, 14 invaders accounted for in less than 10 minutes of combat that had transformed a peaceful waterhole into an abattoir whose stench would mark this territory for weeks. He stood among scattered corpses, sides heaving, blood matting his fur from bite wounds that would heal into new scars, and surveyed his domain with cold satisfaction. Overhead, the wedge-tailed eagles were already descending, joined by crows whose cries filled the air like funeral chorus, and within hours the bodies would be torn apart and scattered, bones dragged off to distant nests, fur blown across red earth, until no visible trace remained except dark stains in dust. But the invisible message would linger far longer, carried on wind as scent, embedded in territorial memory of every dingo and feral cat within kilometers. This ground belongs to the boomer, and the price of trespassing is written in shattered bone and spilled blood beneath the pitiless sun. The silence that followed was not peaceful but heavy, weighted with the kind of finality that settles over battlefields when the last weapon has been lowered, and the only sounds remaining are the wet click of carrion birds landing on cooling flesh and the low moan of wind pushing through ghost gums that had witnessed this pattern countless times across centuries. The boomer moved slowly now, the adrenaline that had fueled 10 minutes of explosive violence beginning to drain from his system and leaving behind the dull ache of bite wounds and the bone-deep fatigue that follows any expenditure of energy. In a land where every calorie must be justified by continued existence, he limped back toward the waterhole, favoring his right foreleg where teeth had found muscle, and drank deeply from the muddy water that reflected a sky now empty of clouds, empty of mercy, empty of anything except the pitiless blue that stretched from horizon to horizon, like a judgment that neither forgave nor condemned but simply observed with the neutrality of geology and time. What had just occurred was not remarkable by the standards of the Outback, where death arrives daily, in forms too numerous to catalogue, and survival is measured not in years, but in the number of times you successfully read the signs that separate tomorrow from oblivion. The 14 foxes had made a tactical error that millions of years of European evolution had not prepared them for. They had treated Australia like conquered territory, rather than a continent whose native inhabitants carried survival strategies refined across epochs that predated the very existence of placental mammals. The boomer was not stronger than the foxes because of individual superiority, but because his entire body was a solution to problems this landscape had been posing since the Pleistocene: how to fight in heat that kills, how to defend territory against multiple attackers, how to read the micro-signals of terrain and wind, and the fatal hesitation in a predator's eyes that says they have already lost, but their body has not yet received the message. There is a theory, unproven and unprovable, that certain animals carry something beyond instinct, something that approaches what humans would call tactical intelligence, the ability to learn, not just from experience, but from observation, to adapt strategies in real time, to understand that territory is not just space, but a collection of advantages that can be leveraged against superior numbers if you know the geometry well enough. Whether the boomer possessed such intelligence or simply acted on genetic programming so deeply encoded it resembled thought is a question that belongs to philosophers and scientists with instruments and hypotheses. What remained undeniable in the red dust of the Flinders Ranges was the outcome: 14 bodies cooling under a sun that would bleach their bones white within weeks, and one scarred patriarch standing above his waterhole, sides heaving, blood-matted, victorious not through luck, but through the perfect intersection of evolution, experience, and terrain. The foxes would not be mourned by the ecosystem they had invaded, would leave no gap in the food web that would cause collapse or imbalance, because they were never meant to be here in the first place, introduced by colonists who thought they could reshape a continent to match their nostalgic memories of English countryside, and instead unleashed cascading extinctions that would be measured in decades and species lost forever. Every native marsupial that had died in fox jaws over the past 2 centuries, the betongs and bilbies, the quolls and bandicoots, the numbats and potorus, had been one more erasure in a catalogue of disappearances that transformed Australia's unique fauna into memory and museum specimens. The boomer had not fought for revenge or justice, or any concept beyond the immediate and ancient imperative to defend what was his, but the result was the same: 14 fewer predators draining the life from an ecosystem that had no evolutionary answers to teeth and cunning, imported from another hemisphere entirely. As the sun climbed toward its apex and temperature pushed past 50 degrees, the boomer retreated to shade beneath the largest river red gum and settled onto his haunches, tail stretched behind him, chest still heaving with the aftermath of combat that would be remembered in this territory long after bones were scattered. If you think this story sounds impossible, if you believe I've exaggerated the capabilities of an animal you've only seen on tourist brochures, then drop a comment below and tell me exactly where you think the science breaks down, because I want to hear your theory about what really happens when instinct meets invasion in the harshest inhabited continent on Earth. The wedge-tailed eagles had already begun their work, tearing into the nearest carcass with beaks designed for exactly this purpose, and within hours, the clearing would swarm with carrion eaters, erasing visible evidence but changing nothing about the fundamental truth that some ground is held not by treaty, but by force measured in kicks that shatter bone and the cold calculation of a creature who understands territory as something so essential that its loss is indistinguishable from death itself. If this brutal tale of survival gripped you, help us reach more nature lovers. Hit subscribe, smash that like button, and drop a comment telling us your city and country. Where in the world are you watching this Outback showdown from?